It was a Sony Portapack. It was at what size? 1/4-inch tape, I think it was.
Yeah.
It was the earliest Porta units they had. They were a booger to try to edit the things, and it was a real problem. But,
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Jack, as you were saying about what you're trying to do or what's trying to be done at the Historical Museum.
yeah. Well, ideally, what we're doing here at the Fallon House is a microcosm of what should have been done in the first place, and that is to preserve a historic district here in San Jose. Now, it's too late for that now, but fortunately, we have the Fallon House and the adjacent adobe structure here. And on its actual site, the Historic Museum is doing a wonderful job of either moving on old structures or building replicas of original structures. But here, people can come and see the things on the original site and try to reflect upon what this town was like in the 1800s and various periods when this building was being used. First as a fancy home for one of its prominent citizens, and later as a hotel and school and the other uses it was put to.
Why is that important that it be on site as opposed to captured as it is in the Historical Museum area?
Well, I don't know. It's the same as going to a zoo and seeing a live animal as opposed to going to a museum and seeing a stuffed one, I think. You're seeing in its context, at least as much of the context as still exists. And I think that's important to understand. And I think that's why it's important we've put markers on the buildings here, even though they've changed in many regards. It lets people know or understand what this city was like during different periods in history.
You seem to be saying that relationships are important in terms of how structures were in relationship to each other.
Yeah, well, that is important. The context of the buildings to their native setting, I think, is important. It's also important in designating buildings historic structures. Very often when the building just stands by itself and it's in a different site or in an area where its fellow buildings have been all removed, you lose its value. It's hard for people to conceive what it was like or how it ever could have been used. We call them contributing structures in the planning trade or in the preservation trade. The adjacent buildings may not be important in themselves, but they add context to the whole area or neighborhood. And of course, this is a premier building, no matter how you look at it, in or out of context.
The idea, though, that so much of San Jose's history has been altered, isn't that correct? And that this represents a means of focusing on history. Absent that, it wouldn't be possible.
Well, you always have photographs and reproductions like we have out at the Historic Museum will give you an idea or a facsimile of an actual place. But here, people can actually trod the same stairs that Fallon and his family trod, in the 1860s. They can run their hands down the same banister that the Fallon children obviously and very likely slid down if they were like any other children in history. They can imagine how the immigrant Italians lived here and how this building has survived through all the times we've been through, from early wars, depressions, earthquakes, and fires. It's a real survivor.
Good. Stop tape. how did you then develop any additional knowledge about either the house or Fallon, and what did you find out?
Well, for doing any kind of historical research at all, you have to go back to the early records, and there aren't a whole lot of real histories written that go into any kind of detail about Fallon, so we have to piece together a lot of things. I think Tom McHenry did that in his book, but we have to use tools like old city directories and catalogs and various kinds of records that are still available in the county and city historical records. What was written about him at the time is interesting, I think, but you know, there are no great reams of, you know, or writings about Fallon or just about anybody else from this era at that time.
He represents somewhat of an enigma then, or is an enigma.
Fallon is no more an enigma than any other man of that period. I mean, they were men of action, and they didn't often write down their thoughts and feelings. It would be wonderful if we could discover a diary that Fallon had written during important periods of his life, but I don't think that's the kind of fellow he was. I can't think of any other real good examples we have of a prominent San Jose citizen who wrote those kind of things down. These people were doers. They were living for the moment, and I don't think they were aware of their place in history. That came later with the pioneer organizations, California Pioneers and so forth. But even those people didn't get a whole lot down in writing, unfortunately.
Well, if that's the case, then the argument that what does exist about Thomas Fallon in that period, if we know very little about him by way of written history, then the kind of history that still stands becomes even more significant, doesn't it?
Well, as much as you can understand a man by the house he built, I don't know. It indicates a certain thing about the man at the time. Obviously, a man of some importance, self-importance, if not actual importance, and of some wealth, because this is not, for its time and place, this is a pretty impressive structure. It must have cost a fair amount of money to construct. This kind of lumber wasn't easily available in those days. Lumber mills weren't turning out finished boards and things like this just for anybody.
Okay. Okay, sir. Fine.
Matt, could you give me could you spell your name?
Okay.
And then give me your title.
As far as title, as far as with the project, as far as...
Yes.
I'm just, okay.
Yes.
My name is Matt Paolercio. It's M-A-T-T P-A-O-L-E-R-C-I-O. And I'm a general contractor. My company's name is Timeless Construction, and I was hired as a consultant to the Fallon House to determine what was original and what wasn't.
And you did that investigation over a 4 or 5 month period?
That is correct.
1990.
That is true.
What did you find out about the house?
Wow. There is a list of things, starting, let's say, with the most important things with the basement. At the basement area of the house is that the basement was not original to the house. In fact, we discovered that the depth of the basement was actually increased at some point in time, probably around the turn of the century, another 2 or 3, well, let's say 2 feet, to give it its existing depth, let's say. That was something that I think took everybody by surprise, because it had been assumed all along that the basement was dug out to that depth, but it was not. The other discovery was that the service wing in which we're standing was indeed original. And not only did we find out that it was original, but we also found out significant clues to give us the overall dimensions, the overall profile of the existing porch that existed south of the service wing. There were clues that were found to give us the rail designs, the roof designs, the porch designs, and determined really beyond any kind of doubt that there existed once, was an original to the house, was the service wing and the side porch.
What else did you find?
Of significance, again, going down back into the basement, that there was an original opening at the southwest corner of the basement.
Just stop for a moment. Go ahead.
Okay. Forgot where I was now.
You're down in the basement.
Okay. We also discovered that there was an original opening to the basement at the southwest corner. The openings that exist now were proven to actually, all the openings were proven that they were not original to the basement area. That there was actually an original opening from the main basement area, which would be the eastern portion of the basement, to the area that actually lies underneath the service wing where we're standing right now. As you go up to the first floor, where we are right now, a couple real significant finds was the fact that it was the original openings going from the service wing into the main part of the house. This is what this was the door opening, and we've determined this area to be the butler's pantry. Where this door led into at this point is the door to the left here, without the transom window, was either a hallway or just a smaller pantry of some sort. These were things that had not been discovered before. Probably the biggest surprise was the existence of an original doorway going from the service wing, which would now be in the direction of the parking lot, which would be north. There was an original doorway here that led out to the northern part of the yard with two existing windows on either side, much larger than the ones that exist now. On the south side of the service wing here, there was an existing doorway approximately 6 feet from the east wall, and there was an existing doorway approximately 4 feet from the west wall coming in. And it hasn't been determined whether there was a window somewhere within that space. Let me see, as far as the first floor went, there were some other interesting discoveries. The fact that the colonnade was not original to the house. The fact that the opening that the colonnade now resides in was once a single door opening, just like the door that is actually to the west of it. That there had been, now moving over to the dining parlors, there actually had been a set of pocket doors, just like in the southern parlors, that were removed at one point, we're assuming, so that there would be a large, grand type of dining area when the house became more of a boarding house than it did a single-family dwelling. Now, as you move to the second story of the original part of the house, I think one of the most interesting discoveries was a business card that was left underneath the wall niche, the only existing wall niche at the top of the stairs. These things were probably manufactured much like our custom cabinetry was today. They were not manufactured on the job site. They were actually done in a shop type of setting, and this business card actually had an address in San Francisco. Langland and Jesse, I believe, was the name, which of course dates back to the 1850s and the 1860s. The only other significant discovery at the second floor was the probability that instead of a doorway, as you go up to the top of the steps, there now exists a doorway going into the addition area. And instead of a doorway, of course, that wasn't there originally, because there was nothing to step into originally in this house at that level, there was a second wall niche that was discovered. So there was, at the top of the stairway, there will be 2 wall niches divided by the window that's actually existing there. And I think that's about it.
There have been significant alterations to this house over the years?
As we go down in the house, starting from the second floor, there were very, very few. From the first floor, of course, we're standing in the area that took most of the changes. The service wing took most of the changes. But, and of course, the basement. The basement's most significant change was probably the extra depth. And then once the addition was built, the area underneath the addition that was that hadn't existed when the original house was here was also made part of the basement. But overall, being that the house is 135 years old, there really hadn't been that many changes, physical changes.
It's relatively straightforward then to be able to go through the house and figure out what is original and what is not original, and then and begin to plot a strategy for bringing it back to its original state.
Yes, Pete. In some cases, it's entirely logical. In this house, what made a lot of the original, not original discoveries actually very easy was the use of square nails versus round nails. It's obvious. I mean, in the 1850s and the 1860s, the use of square nails was 100%. As you get into the 1880s and the 1890s, well, I believe that's when the change started taking place, and you find houses with both of those in use at the same time. You know, but in this house, we went on the premise that the original portions of this house or its members had to be fastened with square nails. If there was a round nail found, it was definitely determined not to be original. Although a square nail doesn't necessarily mean it's original, because of course it could have been done within 20 years of this house being built. But that really cleared the way. That really reduced the number of changes down to a minimum to where we could really focus on the square nail changes in the house, which really does drastically reduce the number of possibilities. Then again, even under those circumstances, we come to what we have here in the service wing, and this area here was really quite complicated because there had been so many changes here. We're standing right now on what is the original floor of the service wing. I removed the second layer of flooring, okay, wood flooring, and it showed the wear and tear on the second layer of flooring showed as though, or it looked as though it had been installed for 100 years, okay. On top of that was linoleum, on top of that was carpet. But altogether, as the newer additions anyway, the carpet and linoleum gets pulled up to reveal the second layer of flooring, you really begin to get an idea just what took place at what time. For instance, what was interesting is that the second layer of flooring, this is just one example, the second layer of flooring, when it was installed, these doors that were here originally were still in, because the floor had actually been notched around the casings that came down to the original floor here. In fact, that's the plug. That was a plug, that piece I left in there. I didn't leave this one, but that's the plug that was put in to fill in the second floor when this doorway was removed. Okay, so it can get a little complicated, as I've said, but overall, this house being as old as it is, and being familiar with the materials used during this period, made it, and the fact that there hadn't been that many changes actually for as old as this house is, actually made the investigation a lot simpler than some of them I've been involved in.
How does it, in terms of its age, you're familiar with other structures that are this old, perhaps older?
Actually not. I have never been in a wood structure quite this old. Actually, the range I'm much more familiar with would be more in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s range.
How does it compare in terms of how it's weathered the time and the use?
Well, that's a really good question because.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speed.
Matt, once again, how, in your estimation, how has the house weathered its the amount of time that's transpired and the different uses that it's been subjected to?
Well, actually, I think it's survived remarkably well because throughout the period of its life, there hasn't been a great deal of care towards the house, taken care of, as far as towards the repair and upkeep of the house. But that is usually the case with old houses as a whole. What makes this one more unusual is the fact that its structural components, all the wood in it is of Douglas fir. That was a real surprise to us as well. Fir is much less disease resistant, or not disease so much as insect resistant, as most of these old houses are redwood. And we all assumed this house would be redwood. So, and redwood takes, redwood just goes on and on and on. And the foundation can fail, but the house will always remain pretty much together just because that there's nothing that really can get into, infiltrate the redwood unless you have, unless there's serious damage done to the house. So on the one hand, just taking the house as it is, I think it's in remarkably good shape when considering all the uses that have transpired. The fact that it is Douglas fir makes it even more of a miracle. It's as good shape as it is right now.
Is it surprising that that Thomas Fallon chose that wood to construct his mansion?
It was surprising to me, not knowing much about Thomas Fallon, but after this discovery and in talking to some of the researchers, it has been speculated that, in fact, stories have been written about he having forest land where he actually milled his own wood. It still is interesting to me why he picked Douglas fir, although today's construction industry, there would be no choice. You'd pick fir over redwood any day. It actually could have been, excuse me?
Because of the cost.
Well, it's stronger. It's a structural wood. Redwood is a very soft, non-structural type of wood. Doug fir will support a lot more weight than a similar sized piece in redwood. So in today's standards, you would never use redwood for structure, for floorboards, for foundation wood. Or excuse me, you would for foundation whenever you, again, get close to the earth. Because again, redwood is much more resistant to decay and rot. And termites. Termites don't really touch redwood. And especially the redwood they milled back in this period, which was completely clear. It was stock that would last forever and ever and ever. It was the old growth redwood. So we were surprised to find the house built out of fir, but the reason for that could be that it came from one of his pockets of forest that Thomas Fallon owned himself and milled. I believe it was down in the Santa Cruz area. So And in that time, maybe redwood was cheaper, and this was considered to be a more expensive way of building a house. It's just that this is the only house, let me say, this is the only house of this vintage that I've ever seen Douglas Fir in. And we're talking about the flooring, we're talking about all the structural members are out of fir.
You would think that given that, and its weakness, let's say, for standing time and standing disease and pest, that the Fallon House would have been weakened over time as a result of that first choice.
Right. Well, what has really helped was that they did use, the house is sitting on 4x6 redwood sills, okay? And that, of course, makes the connection a little less direct to the earth, to termites. Plus, this house was built 4 feet off the ground. I mean, today's standards, I believe your house has to be 18 inches off the ground, okay? Again, allowing enough space so that termites don't have a ready-built type of avenue to get into your house. I mean, being 4 feet off the ground, really, plus with the basement being partially excavated, we're talking about there could have been at least 6 feet from the bottom of the floor joist on the first floor to the basement, which will really add to the lifetime of the house. It is sagging in areas. There are some weak points, but that's really typical of brick foundations. You know, brick foundations don't last nearly as long as the house will, actually.
Do you think it will be a relatively straightforward process to renovate it and bring it back to its original state?
I think it should be. I really think it should be. The only difficult part will be probably at the very beginning. The addition area of the house has to be disconnected from the original house. That has to be carefully done so that any original parts or any original part of the house is not damaged. Plus, there have been some old original parts of the house used on the addition, and those have to be salvaged and refurbished to be used back in the original part of the house. So it's not going to be one of these things, one of these projects where you can just go in hog wild at the very beginning. I foresee that once the addition is removed and the parts that are going to be reused in the house are salvaged, it's a pretty straightforward project, aside, as far as physically, aside later on when we begin to, or when salvage parts will be needed to duplicate what is missing in the Fallon House. The fireplaces, the pocket doors. There'll be I believe there'll be a few of, there'll be the entrance doors, exit doors here in the service wing that'll have to be either fabricated or found from some salvage outlet. But otherwise, it's it's a pretty straightforward, should be a pretty straightforward project.
What will San Jose have when it's completed, when it's restored in its original state?
Well, actually, I have spent some time around the country going to seeing restored historical places around the country, and from what the Thomas Fallon House could be, in the amount that has been left in its original state, I have only seen one house that actually, with this much, as the state officials will call it, original historical fabric left in the house. And if like the service wing is completely restored, it's going to be a jewel. It's going to be an absolute jewel, a real rarity to find, I believe, anywhere in Northern California, if not the state. A house of this vintage, it's going to be one of a kind.
Yes.